James Foster, CEO of Skyway Airways, is increasingly troubled by numerous passenger complaints, particularly concerning discrimination towards black travelers. The reports have become too frequent to ignore, with passengers voicing their concerns about being treated unfairly based on their race. Many of these complaints specifically highlight instances of poor service, bias, and unequal treatment from the airline staff. James, understanding the weight of these accusations and the potential impact on the airline's reputation, feels compelled to take action. The complaints are not just troubling in terms of public relations, they reveal a deeper, systemic issue within the company that needs urgent attention. Determined to address the situation from the ground level, James makes the bold decision to experience the issues firsthand by flying under the radar. This choice marks the beginning of his journey to confront and resolve the racial discrimination within the airline. Determined to understand the problem firsthand, James Foster, CEO of Skyway Airways, decides to fly incognito. His goal is to experience the airline service as a regular passenger, especially as a black individual traveling in economy class. He believes this approach will give him a clearer insight into the issues reported by passengers and allow him to see how staff interact with individuals from different backgrounds. James knows that, as CEO, his experiences on the ground may not reflect the true nature of the service provided, especially if employees are overly deferential when they recognize him. By blending in with regular travelers, James hopes to gauge the level of fairness and inclusivity in Skyway's operations. On the day of his flight, James carefully plans his journey. He avoids any special treatment and makes sure to dress like any other economy passenger. As he boards the plane, he reminds himself that this is an opportunity to gather vital information, and he needs to remain unnoticed. This undercover mission marks the beginning of his commitment to addressing the problems head-on and enacting real change within his company. James is aware that the path ahead might be uncomfortable, but he's ready to confront the issue and take steps to. As James Foster settled into his economy class seat, he watched the flight attendants go about their duties, paying particular attention to how they interacted with passengers. From the moment the cabin crew started their rounds, James noticed a troubling pattern. Flight attendant Rachel, who appeared to be in charge of the section, was exceptionally warm and accommodating to the affluent passengers sitting in first class and the business class rows. She greeted them with smiles, made small talk, and ensured they had everything they needed, moving through their aisles with a noticeable level of attentiveness. However, when Rachel reached the economy section, her demeanor shifted. James observed how she seemed dismissive of passengers who weren't dressed in high-end clothing or who appeared to be from a different social background. As she reached his seat, her smile faded, and her service became curt and indifferent. She barely acknowledged him, offering a cold, "What would you like to drink?" without the usual pleasantries or attention to detail she'd given other passengers. James could feel the difference in how he was treated compared to those around him. Other passengers who appeared wealthier received faster service and were treated with much more kindness. The contrast was glaring, and James couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in his stomach as he realized that what he had been hearing from passengers was true. Discrimination was happening right under his nose, and he was experiencing it firsthand. This was not just a few isolated incidents. It was a pattern, something ingrained in the airline's culture. James knew that this could no longer be ignored. It was clear, he had to take immediate action to address this discrimination and make Skyway Airways a truly inclusive company for all passengers, regardless of their background. As the flight continued, James Foster sat quietly in his seat, watching the crew interact with the passengers. He was still absorbing the unsettling reality of the service he had witnessed, but what happened next solidified his understanding of the deep-seated issues at Skyway Airways. During the drink service, Rachel, the flight attendant, made her way down the narrow aisle with a tray of drinks. She moved quickly, but it was clear she wasn't paying close attention to where she was going. As she passed by James, her elbow nudged the tray, sending a cup of hot coffee spilling over onto his lap. The liquid quickly soaked through his pants, and he jumped up, startled by the burning sensation. The coffee had been scalding, and for a moment, he stood there, unsure of how Rachel would react. Rachel, however, didn't seem to register the urgency of the situation. Rather than offering an immediate apology or helping him clean up, she looked at him indifferently. Her face remained neutral, almost as if the accident didn't matter. "Sorry about that," she muttered flatly, still standing with the tray in her hand, making no effort to offer any assistance in cleaning up the mess she had caused. James stood there, speechless for a moment. His frustration grew, not just because of the spill, but because of the lack of care or empathy Rachel showed. She had been so attentive to the wealthier passengers, almost overly concerned with their comfort, yet when it came to a black passenger in economy class, her response was apathetic. The coldness with which she addressed the situation felt like a direct reflection of the inequality that pervaded the airline's culture. As James sat back down, he tried to brush the coffee off as best as he could. But the sting of the incident lingered, a constant reminder of the stark difference in treatment. It wasn't just about the spill. It was about the underlying bias, the subtle but clear message that some passengers mattered more than others. The realization hit him harder than he expected. This wasn't a random occurrence, it was part of a systemic problem that Skyway Airways needed to address immediately. James knew that what had happened wasn't just a minor mistake, it was a glaring sign of the issues that needed urgent reform. This wasn't just about poor customer service, it was about deeper issues of racial discrimination that had gone unchecked for far too long. He couldn't ignore it anymore. It was time for change. The rest of the flight was uncomfortable for James Foster. The burn from the hot coffee was still stinging his skin, and his shirt was soaked. He tried to focus on the rest of the passengers and take in the full experience of what was happening on board, but it was hard to ignore the growing resentment he felt toward the treatment he had received. For the rest of the journey, Rachel continued to go about her duties, though she seemed to avoid his row. James wasn't surprised, he had already seen enough to understand that she wasn't interested in correcting her mistake or showing any genuine concern. Her behavior had been dismissive from the start, and it seemed now that the incident had only made her more indifferent. But despite the anger and frustration simmering inside him, James kept his composure. His decision to fly incognito was still about understanding the issue from the passenger's perspective, even if that meant enduring poor service firsthand. It wasn't until the plane began its descent that Rachel returned to James's row. He could see her coming from a distance, her tray of coffee cups in hand, her expression once again neutral. She was heading straight for him, and despite everything, James steeled himself. He wasn't going to let her indifference get to him again. He had to remain calm if he was going to change anything at Skyway Airways. Rachel reached his row and set the tray down in front of him with a small clink. She looked at him, her eyes briefly widening as if she had just noticed something. "Here's a fresh cup of coffee," she said, her voice slightly strained. "I'm sorry for the spill earlier." Her words felt rehearsed, like an apology she had been told to make, not a genuine expression of remorse. The lack of sincerity in her tone was evident, and James could feel his frustration boiling over. But then, something unexpected happened. As she stood there, her eyes darting between the coffee cup and James's face, recognition slowly dawned on her. It was a subtle shift in her expression, the brief flicker of realization in her eyes that caught James's attention immediately. She hesitated, then glanced down at her name tag, her fingers lingering on the tray. James saw it, her mind was working quickly, and the gears were turning. She was starting to realize who he was. "Wait," Rachel began, her voice faltering as she looked at James once more. You're the CEO of Skyway Airways, aren't you?" James's gaze met hers, and for a moment, he considered telling her the truth. He could have revealed his identity right then, confronted her with the weight of who he was, but something inside him told him to hold back. He had come on this flight to experience what regular passengers faced, not to leverage his status to change the situation. So, he simply nodded, his expression neutral. "Yes, I am," he said calmly. "I am James Foster, CEO of Skyway Airways." Rachel's face went pale. Her posture stiffened, and she took a small step back, as if trying to distance herself from the reality of what had just happened. She had likely been unaware that the man she had treated so poorly was her boss, the very person who would be responsible for the changes that needed to happen in the company. I didn't recognize you," Rachel stammered, her voice shaky now. I'm sorry, Mr. Foster. I didn't mean," James held up his hand, cutting her off. "It's fine," he said evenly, though his thoughts were far from calm. "But let me ask you something. Why was the service so different between the passengers in first class and economy? Why was I treated with such indifference when those around me were treated with courtesy?" Rachel's face flushed with discomfort. She shifted uneasily, avoiding his gaze. Well, I try to give the best service to all passengers," she said, her words coming out in a half-hearted rush. "But some people are more difficult to please than others. I guess I just assumed that you wouldn't mind so much." James's eyes narrowed. "You assumed I wouldn't mind," he repeated, his voice steady but with an edge of disbelief. "Why would you assume that? Why would any passenger, regardless of how they look, be treated any differently? This kind of behavior isn't just a mistake. It's systemic." Rachel's face turned a deeper shade of red, and she glanced down at her feet, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation. I don't know what you're talking about," she muttered. "I didn't mean to cause any harm." "But you did," James said firmly. "The way you treated me, and the other passengers in economy, wasn't just a mistake. It was a reflection of something that's deeply wrong at Skyway Airways. It's the same kind of treatment that many of our black passengers have complained about for years. It's a pattern, Rachel. And I'm here to address it." The realization that her actions were part of a larger issue seemed to hit Rachel hard. Her face paled further, and she shifted her weight from one foot to the other. I didn't think of it that way," she stammered. "I didn't realize. I just thought, you thought wrong," James interrupted gently. "And now, we need to do something about it." Rachel nodded slowly, clearly shaken by the exchange. James could see the weight of her mistake sinking in, and for the first time during the flight, he saw a glimpse of genuine remorse in her eyes. But James wasn't interested in her apology, not yet, anyway. What mattered now was making sure this was the last time something like this happened on one of his flights. "Rachel," he said, his voice softer now, "I'm not interested in punishment. But I am interested in change. I want to make sure that Skyway Airways becomes an airline where all passengers are treated with the same respect, no matter who they are or how they look. You'll be hearing from me, and I expect you to be a part of that change. Do you understand?" Rachel nodded again, her expression one of quiet guilt mixed with newfound awareness. "Yes, Mr. Foster," she replied. As she walked away, James sat back in his seat, reflecting on the conversation. It was clear to him now that Skyway Airways had a long way to go. The issues of racial discrimination weren't just a few isolated incidents, they were part of the airline's culture. James wasn't sure what the future would hold, but he knew one thing for sure, this was just the beginning of the work that lay ahead. He had to address the deeper issues, and Rachel's realization, however small, was a sign that change was possible. Now, it was up to him to lead the way. The flight had finally landed, and as passengers disembarked, James Foster sat in his seat, staring out the window at the tarmac below. The roar of the plane's engines faded as the cabin lights flickered on, signaling that the journey had come to an end. However, for James, the journey had only just begun. The reality of what he had experienced over the past few hours weighed heavily on his mind, and as the passengers around him moved, some chatting and laughing, James felt the full weight of the situation settling in. His incognito flight had been nothing short of eye-opening. He had witnessed firsthand the subtle yet pervasive discrimination that took place within his own airline, a company that he had built and led for years. He had hoped for a minor inconvenience or perhaps a misunderstanding, but what he experienced was far more troubling. The disparities in service were so stark, the indifference so clear, that it was impossible to ignore. James had tried to remain an objective observer, but as the flight went on, he couldn't shake the feeling of being looked down upon, treated with coldness and even contempt by the flight attendants. What bothered him the most was the inconsistency in treatment. Affluent passengers, many of whom were white, had received the kind of attentive service one would expect from a premium airline. They were greeted with warm smiles, offered snacks, and made to feel like their presence was valued. Meanwhile, James, sitting in economy class, was treated like an afterthought. The flight attendant, Rachel, had barely acknowledged him, serving him with little enthusiasm, even going so far as to spill coffee on his shirt without an apology. At first, James had tried to brush it off. After all, one mistake could be attributed to human error. But then the indifference continued, and the glaring differences in service became undeniable. Rachel's attitude toward him and other passengers who appeared less affluent was dismissive, as though they were unworthy of her attention. Her response when the coffee spilled, barely a muttered apology, had confirmed that this wasn't a simple oversight, it was part of a larger pattern, something systemic within the airline. As the flight ended, James felt a deep sense of frustration building inside him. He had hoped that the issues passengers had raised about Skyway Airways were exaggerated, or that they were isolated incidents. But the reality was far more troubling. It was clear now that the discrimination wasn't just a few bad apples, it was woven into the fabric of the airline's operations. It was in the attitudes of the staff, in the unequal treatment of passengers, and in the unspoken assumptions that some passengers were more deserving of respect than others. James knew that the problems were not confined to just the flight attendants or one individual. This was about a much deeper issue, a culture of bias that had been allowed to flourish unchecked. It was about the way people of color, particularly black passengers, were treated as lesser, viewed through a lens of suspicion or inferiority. It was about the subtle yet deeply ingrained belief that people like him, people who looked like him, didn't belong in the same spaces as those who had the wealth or status to be afforded the better treatment. James realized that this issue was not just a service problem, it was a racial problem, and it had been festering within the airline for far too long. As he sat there, reflecting on everything that had transpired during the flight, James couldn't help but feel betrayed by the system he had helped build. The airline he had worked so hard to develop had become a reflection of society's deeper biases, the very biases that he had hoped to challenge when he started his career. This wasn't just about customer service, it was about fairness, respect, and human dignity. If Skyway Airways was truly going to be a leader in the industry, it had to be more than just a business, it had to be a model for inclusivity, respect, and fairness for all passengers, regardless of their background. James knew that this would be a monumental task, but he also knew that the first step had to come from him. As the CEO, it was his responsibility to lead by example and ensure that every passenger, no matter their race, background, or appearance, felt welcome and valued at Skyway Airways. He couldn't allow the airline to continue perpetuating discrimination, even if it had been happening for years. The change had to start with him, and it had to start now. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. As much as he had wanted to be a silent observer, he couldn't remain passive anymore. The policies and practices that allowed such discrimination to thrive within the airline needed to be overhauled. There had to be systemic change, not just in how employees were trained, but in the very culture of the company. He couldn't let the anger and frustration simmer inside him without taking action. He had a duty to the passengers, to his employees, and to himself to make Skyway Airways a place where everyone, no matter their background, could fly with dignity. As James left the plane and entered the terminal, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The work ahead would not be easy, and there would undoubtedly be resistance, both inside and outside the company. But James was resolute. The changes would come, and they would come quickly. The first thing on his agenda was a comprehensive review of the airline's policies, training programs, and internal practices. He would take immediate steps to implement anti-bias training for all employees, focusing not just on the surface-level issues but also on addressing the root causes of discrimination that were so deeply embedded in the airline's culture. James also knew that this fight wouldn't be won with policies alone. He would need to foster a cultural shift within Skyway Airways. A shift toward inclusivity and respect, a shift where every employee understood that their actions had consequences and that the airline's reputation depended on treating every passenger with the same level of dignity, regardless of their race or socioeconomic status. The road ahead would be long, but James Foster was ready to take it. He was prepared to lead Skyway Airways into a new era, one where every passenger felt seen, heard, and respected. The day after his incognito flight, James Foster couldn't shake the feeling of urgency that clung to him. He had seen the troubling reality of discrimination firsthand, no longer just a complaint filed by passengers but an undeniable truth he had experienced in a way that could not be ignored. As the CEO of Skyway Airways, it was his responsibility to address the growing issue of racial discrimination that had taken root within the airline. He knew immediate action was needed, but the true scope of the changes would require more than just a few surface-level fixes. It required a cultural overhaul, one that started with the top leadership. Determined to take decisive action, James immediately called an emergency meeting with his executive team. He had made up his mind that the airline would no longer tolerate any form of discrimination, and he needed the full support of his leadership team to enact the changes that Skyway Airways desperately needed. His phone call was short and to the point: "I need everyone in the conference room in 1 hour. We're having an urgent meeting to address some serious issues." When James entered the boardroom, he was met with a quiet, anxious atmosphere. The senior leadership team, VPs, senior managers, and heads of departments, were all seated around the table. As James sat down at the head, his eyes scanned the room, his thoughts fixed on the task ahead. He had no intention of sugarcoating the situation. The problems within the airline were deep, and they could no longer be ignored. "I've called this meeting because we are facing a serious problem within our company," James began, his voice calm but filled with a sense of purpose. "We've received numerous complaints of discrimination from our passengers, particularly from black travelers. And after personally experiencing it myself, I can no longer stand by while we let these issues persist." There was a noticeable shift in the room, as everyone knew the severity of the situation. Some executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others looked at James, clearly aware of the scale of what was being addressed. James didn't give them time to respond. He had thought long and hard about what needed to be done and how fast the changes had to happen. "The evidence is clear," James continued. "The airline's policies, or lack thereof, have allowed systemic bias and discrimination to exist within our operations. We cannot afford to ignore it any longer. We are going to take immediate steps to address this issue, starting with the suspension of the crew members involved in yesterday's incident." The room went quiet as James's words hung in the air. The specific incident he referred to, the treatment he had endured in economy class, had exposed the problem in a very personal way. James had chosen to experience the service as a regular passenger, but what he had encountered wasn't just bad customer service, it was a direct reflection of a toxic, discriminatory culture that had been allowed to thrive unchecked. One of the senior managers, Lisa Dawson, a VP in charge of operations, spoke up first. "James, we're all aware that there's an issue, but do you think suspending the staff members involved is enough? We need a comprehensive plan to prevent this from happening again." James nodded, appreciating Lisa's point. He had been thinking the same thing. The issue wasn't just one or two rogue employees, it was a deeply ingrained problem that needed a systemic solution. He couldn't rely on just disciplinary actions to solve it. "I agree, Lisa," James said, leaning forward. "This is bigger than just suspending a few individuals. We need a complete review of our policies, and that starts with mandatory anti-bias training for every employee, from the top down. We also need to implement a zero-tolerance policy against discrimination, which will be enforced at every level." The executives in the room exchanged looks, the weight of the decision sinking in. They knew this wasn't going to be easy, and they knew it was going to require major changes at the core of the company's operations. James continued, but training alone isn't enough. We need to overhaul our hiring practices and ensure that our staff, especially in customer-facing roles, reflect the diversity we want to foster. We also need to create a space for employees to report discrimination without fear of retaliation. This will be part of a broader cultural shift within the company. Lisa nodded in agreement, but she wasn't the only one. Another executive, Carl Matthews, the head of human resources, spoke up. James, I think we also need to be transparent with the public about what's happening. A press release and an official apology to our passengers will show them that we're taking this seriously. But we also need to establish clear, measurable goals so we can track our progress. James smiled, appreciating Carl's insight. Exactly. It's not just about saying the right things, but about showing real commitment to change. I want us to make public our progress in diversifying the workforce, the changes in our training programs, and how we're addressing passenger complaints. I want our customers to see that Skyway Airways isn't just talking the talk, we're walking the walk. The room buzzed with agreement. Everyone knew this was an opportunity to create a new culture at Skyway Airways, one that prioritized fairness, respect, and inclusivity. But James was also keenly aware that this kind of change wouldn't come easily, and it would take time to truly reshape the company's culture. After a long discussion, James laid out the timeline for the first steps. The immediate suspension of the crew members involved would be followed by the launch of the anti-bias training within the next month. They also agreed to implement a third-party audit of their hiring practices and customer service policies to identify further areas of improvement. By the end of the quarter, James insisted that Skyway Airways would issue a public statement outlining the company's commitment to addressing systemic discrimination and detailing the measures being taken. I know this won't be easy, James concluded, his tone resolute. There will be resistance, and there will be mistakes along the way. But we cannot let that stop us. We are a company that serves people from all walks of life. Our passengers deserve the best, and that means we must ensure that every single one of them is treated with respect, no matter their background or their appearance. This is the future of Skyway Airways, and I'm counting on each of you to help make it happen. The meeting ended with a sense of purpose in the air. James knew that this was only the beginning, but he also knew that the airline had the power to lead by example. The work ahead would be difficult, but it was necessary. James was ready to do whatever it took to ensure that Skyway Airways became a model of inclusivity, fairness, and respect, a place where every passenger, no matter their race or background, could feel welcome. The weeks following the emergency meeting were intense. James Foster knew that implementing meaningful change at Skyway Airways wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to follow through. The groundwork had been laid in that initial meeting with his senior team, but now came the real work, pushing forward with the necessary reforms, making sure they were executed properly, and ensuring that everyone, from the staff to the passengers, could see the impact of these changes. James's first priority was the company-wide anti-bias training. He knew that addressing the root cause of the discrimination meant educating his staff about the biases they may not even realize they were carrying. The training would be mandatory for every employee, from the flight attendants to the management team. No one would be exempt. It wasn't just about ensuring better service, it was about changing the culture of Skyway Airways. James was clear with his leadership team: the airline's treatment of customers could not be based on assumptions about their race, background, or appearance. Every passenger, no matter who they were, deserved to be treated with the utmost respect. He also knew that simply offering training wasn't enough. There had to be systems in place for employees to report discrimination without fear of retaliation. Skyway Airways needed to create an environment where passengers could feel safe, and where employees knew that if they saw discriminatory behavior, they were obligated to speak out. As part of his commitment to change, James made the decision to take Skyway's commitment public. He knew transparency would be key in rebuilding trust with customers. Within a few weeks, the company issued a press release outlining the changes, detailing the steps the airline was taking to create a more inclusive culture. The statement included the immediate rollout of anti-bias training, the implementation of a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination, and a renewed focus on diversity in hiring. The public response was overwhelmingly positive. Many passengers expressed their gratitude for the airline taking such decisive action, and several employees, both current and former, came forward to praise the new direction. However, there were others, particularly those resistant to change, who voiced skepticism about whether Skyway Airways could truly follow through on its promises. James knew that the skepticism was a natural part of the process. Changing the culture of a company wasn't something that happened overnight. It would take time, but he was committed to making it work. He met with senior staff regularly to review the progress, ensuring that the steps laid out in the plan were being followed and that the impact was being felt across the airline. One of the most significant changes was the focus on hiring practices. Skyway Airways made a concerted effort to diversify its workforce, ensuring that staff at all levels reflected the diverse communities the airline served. This not only provided a more welcoming environment for passengers but also allowed employees to feel more seen and heard within the company. Despite the growing support and progress, James knew this was just the beginning. He continued to push forward, determined to ensure that Skyway Airways became a true leader in inclusivity. The success of the company's new initiatives would ultimately depend on the collective efforts of every employee and the ongoing commitment to make the changes permanent. For James, this wasn't just about repairing the airline's reputation, it was about creating a space where everyone felt valued and respected. He understood that to truly change Skyway Airways, he needed to lead by example, showing both his staff and passengers that discrimination had no place at his airline. And slowly, over time, the feedback from customers and employees alike began to show that the changes were having an impact. Skyway Airways was on the path to becoming not just an airline, but a symbol of fairness and equity in the travel industry. As the months passed following the significant policy changes at Skyway Airways, James Foster began to see the fruits of his labor. The airline had become a model for inclusivity, and the shifts in both company culture and public perception were undeniable. The press releases, public apologies, and promises of systemic change had not only been heard, they had sparked a movement within the industry. Customer feedback improved dramatically. Passengers, especially those from marginalized communities, began to share their positive experiences on social media and in customer reviews. They expressed gratitude for the more inclusive environment, where they felt valued regardless of their background. The changes James had implemented were starting to show tangible results, and the airline was being praised for its commitment to fairness. Internally, the atmosphere within Skyway Airways also began to shift. Employees, especially those who had been wary or skeptical of the new policies, started to take pride in the company's new direction. The mandatory anti-bias training had fostered open discussions about discrimination, and employees felt empowered to stand up for fairness. The airline had created a culture where everyone, from the flight attendants to management, understood the importance of treating every passenger with respect. The employees, too, felt more respected, knowing they were working for an organization that was making genuine efforts to address past issues. Industry leaders began to take notice. Skyway Airways' reputation as a company that was serious about inclusivity and fairness began to spread. James received invitations to speak at conferences and forums on diversity and inclusion, and the airline's efforts became a benchmark for other companies looking to improve their own policies. James was proud of the progress they had made, but he was also aware that the work wasn't finished. Real change took time, and he was committed to ensuring that Skyway Airways continued to lead the charge in transforming the aviation industry. For James, the journey had been challenging, but the rewards were worth it. Skyway Airways wasn't just an airline anymore, it had become an example of how a company could evolve, showing that systemic change was possible when leadership was committed to doing the hard work. The decision to overhaul the culture at Skyway Airways wasn't without its challenges, but the results spoke for themselves. As the airline's commitment to diversity, inclusivity, and fairness became evident, James Foster was increasingly confident that the changes would not only benefit his company but would also reshape the entire industry. However, the real measure of success would come from seeing how these efforts influenced the broader business landscape, especially in terms of public perception and external consequences. While Skyway Airways was becoming a beacon of ethical standards in the airline industry, the effects on the bank involved in the discriminatory incidents were also starting to unfold. As the media reported on James's journey in Skyway Airways' transformation, the story of the systemic bias within the company and the leadership's proactive steps to remedy it began to gain national attention. Customers and activists began to highlight the contrast between Skyway's new direction and the banking institution's role in perpetuating inequality. The negative publicity surrounding the bank reached a fever pitch as customer dissatisfaction spread across social media platforms. Passengers began questioning the bank's practices, particularly how it treated people of color, and demanding that it take responsibility for its actions. Pressure mounted on the bank to take visible steps to address the allegations of discrimination. The financial repercussions were swift. The bank saw a noticeable drop in stock prices, and many of its clients began pulling their business, choosing to invest in more socially responsible companies. The fallout was significant enough that the bank's top executives had no choice but to issue a public apology, but it was clear that their efforts to address the issue were too little, too late. Meanwhile, Skyway Airways continued to rise in stature. As the airline became known for its ethical leadership, James Foster received invitations to speak at major business forums and corporate ethics conferences. His approach to tackling systemic discrimination set a new standard for corporate responsibility, earning him accolades and recognition. The industry was watching, and it was becoming clear that ethical practices and inclusivity were no longer just trends, they were the future of business. For James, the true victory wasn't just about Skyway Airways' improved reputation. It was about showing the world that change was possible, that corporate leaders could do more than just apologize for the past, they could create a future defined by fairness, respect, and accountability.